Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. The Covid-19 pandemic has plunged the world economy into a deep recession. How long will it last, and what kind of recovery can we expect? Well, in large part, that depends on what governments do next. Will they pile up a mountain of future debt in order to cope with today's crisis? My guest is the former governor of India's Reserve Bank, Raghuram Rajan. Do the old rules of fiscal discipline no longer apply? Raghuram Rajan in Chicago, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Let's begin with the simple proposition that the COVID-19 pandemic has been very damaging to the world economy. The question is, just how bad is it going to get? What's your answer?
Well, it depends on this very big imponderable. How successful are we to be in arresting the spread of the pandemic? We've dealt with the first phase in industrial countries. We've brought it down. We've brought the reproduction rate down below 1, and these countries are opening up. Is there a second phase? And of course, it's still rampant in the emerging markets, Brazil, Russia, India, and of course in Africa, it's starting to grow in a number of places. So I think we still have to wait and see how bad it can get. It's already very, very bad.
You recently wrote, I'm in the camp which has grown progressively more and more pessimistic about the outlook. Is that because of your focus on some of the emerging markets, or because of what you might perceive as mismanagement of the problem in some of the developed, richer countries?
I think it's a bit of everything, right? What we've seen in the industrial countries is different countries have had different degrees of success. That is also true of the emerging markets. Vietnam is struggling to prevent its first death from the virus. On the other hand, Brazil has had tens of thousands of deaths already, and it's just expanding. So management has been variable, but also we don't really know how bad this can get, whether we have a second wave. We spent an enormous amount of money already on cushioning the effects of the first wave. There's not a lot left in the kitty for the second wave, if that actually comes.
What President Trump wants to see is a V-shaped recovery. That is, a steep plunge down at the beginning of this crisis, followed by a very rapid ascent back to some sort of economic normality as people believe the lid has been put on the spread of the pandemic. Do you believe in this concept of a V-shaped recovery?
Well, it's possible to get a rapid recovery in some areas. For example, manufacturing, if you can get the supply chains working and if demand starts picking up. All these are big ifs. On the other hand, I mean, who's going to venture into a restaurant? Even in China, with all the tracking that they're doing, you still see that many restaurants are half or three quarters empty still. People aren't confident enough to go into places which are very crowded. So my sense is that any recovery is going to take place over time, especially in the high contact service sectors, hospitality, travel, etc. But even in manufacturing, getting the supply chain synchronized, making sure that your supplier in Mexico also has his plant running, and that your buyer in Europe is willing to accept delivery. This is also going to take time. So I think it's V-shaped is looking a lot more optimistic, even if we don't have fresh outbreaks of the virus.
What's interesting about your analysis there is that it isn't just about controlling and curbing the spread of the virus. It's also about addressing public perception, confidence, attitude. Because as you point out, in many sectors, important sectors of the US and the wider global economy, I'm thinking aviation, I'm thinking all of those sectors that rely on public confidence in being in open spaces with other people, whether it be entertainment, restaurants, many leisure activities, there is now a profound confidence problem, isn't there?
There is, right? In some sense, the only answer to this is either knowledge that everybody's been vaccinated, or that everybody has been tested recently and don't actually carry the virus. Otherwise, you're always going to be worried. There's somebody who's come in here who is a carrier, and what will that do to me?
Let's get into the detail of economic policy making across the world and tap into your experience as both a former governor of the Indian Reserve Bank and also chief economist at the IMF. You've got a lot of experience to bring to the table, particularly with the nature of fiscal policy and the use of debt. What we see in the United States and many other countries is vast expansion of borrowing, of debt, to finance economic recovery packages to help people in the here and now. You traditionally have been very cautious about the use of debt to fuel economic recovery and growth. Are you just as cautious today?
Well, I think the immediate reaction when the virus hit was appropriate. The sense was this would be only a couple of months, that the policy objective was to put the economy in a coma, protect people, protect their jobs, protect firms. And 2 months later, with a swish of the wand, the economy would wake up and we'd be back to normal. That was the V-shaped recovery. That was a sense that this was all easily tackled. Now, as we see, it's going to take much longer. There is a real question about whether the economy should also be transformed in this process, whether it's enough to put it to sleep, or whether we need a new economy to take care of all the concerns about proximity, as well as the ability to now work at a distance that far more people have realized they have. So there will be transformations. And are we sort of keeping the economy from transforming? We're also discovering it's extremely costly to keep people at home, extremely costly to keep these lockdowns. The US has issued $3 trillion worth of debt this quarter. And, a trillion here, a trillion there, it becomes real money very, very quickly. The reality is now we have to make harder choices, pick and choose. What do we protect? Clearly, people have to be protected. But do we protect their jobs? Perhaps they need new jobs elsewhere. We need to make sure that happens. We need to provide credit at that time. But do we have to keep a restaurant alive for the next year while it is closed? Or can we let it at this point close?
If I understand you correctly then, Mr. Rajan, you seem to be saying that policymakers need to be a little bit more brutal, a bit more cold-blooded and hard-eyed about the current situation, rather than propping up, as you put it, restaurants or maybe even airlines, which you might believe do not have a long-term future in their current form. Are you saying that those businesses should be allowed to go bust, and not to allow them to go bust is economically deeply inefficient and unsustainable?
Well, we certainly need to start taking advantage of bankruptcy procedures and restructuring. Some of these airlines will have to shed some planes. Some of them will have to downsize somewhat, given that air travel might be more constrained over the next few years. So I think we should now that we've sort of steadied the economy a little bit, before the advent of new challenges, perhaps we should let the natural processes take over, market processes like bankruptcy, like restructuring. Some entities will obviously survive, but they may need much less debt than they have. Piling on more debt onto them is probably a bad option at this point. So I think...
Right. Isn't it time for some reassessment, though, of your aversion to debt? Let me quote to you another respected economist. I know you know him well, Ken Rogoff, who's written a lot about the nature of the sort of debt curve and how dangerous national debt can be to economic growth. He says any sensible policy right now is going to have us racking up the deficit for a long time. And he says if we go up another $10 trillion, I wouldn't even blink at that right now. So he's saying this is a very special, unprecedented situation, and our responses need to be unprecedented too.
We have to be careful in two ways. One, of course, is I do think we will require much more money to be spent, but it may not be in propping entities up and trying to make sure nothing changes, but it might be in ensuring there's a substantial stimulus so that the massive unemployment that we have starts being brought down relatively quickly going forward. This may take the form, for example, of a massive infrastructure package in the US. But what I'm saying is we need to start shifting because we will need resources for that also down the line. And of course, the post-COVID world will require stronger worker protections, better healthcare. That will also require money. So let's make sure that we are not doing the wrong thing at this point, which is keeping unviable entities alive at enormous cost to our finances. That's one. The second is we have to be very careful.
I understand your point about the need for transformation, but I do want to get specific on the question of how much debt is too much debt. Traditionally, economists like you have worried a great deal if nation states take on a debt that represents more than 100% of their national income, their GDP. But we now look at a country like Italy, which has been hurt very badly by COVID-19. Its economy, frankly, in ruins. And it looks as though their national debt in the next year or two will spiral beyond 160 or more percent of GDP. Are you saying that is simply unsustainable and that Italy is going to have to completely rethink its national economy?
No, what has changed, of course, is the level of interest rates. They've come down a lot, and higher levels of debt are affordable at these levels of interest rate. However, if you have an enormous amount of debt, it prevents you from doing some things, especially at times like this. So take Italy again. Italy hasn't had the massive spending packages that Germany has had, precisely because its debt is so high and it fears roiling the financial markets by taking on a whole lot more debt. Its stimulus has been in the single digits compared to the double digits that have been there in most Northern European countries. So that is one very, very important concern. The second concern in Europe is you're going to have a two-stage Europe. You have Southern Europe with debt to GDP in the 130, 140% of GDP, and of course in Italy's case even higher. And you have a Northern Europe which is tootling along at 60 and 70%. A 50 percentage point difference, that's going to create a whole lot of angst post-crisis also, which is one reason why this common European budget that they're planning makes sense, because these disparities get alarming in a single currency.
Well, that's a fascinating take, and I want to push you further then on the world's various sort of reactions to the emergency. And let's start with Europe. You seem to be suggesting that unless Europe gets serious about fiscal integration, a much deeper economic union, then the Eurozone as currently constituted could collapse. Is that what you're saying? Because the divergences between the north of Europe and the south have become so stark, so pronounced, that they're not sustainable in the current form.
That's broadly what I'm trying to say. I mean, Europe is really an idealistic project. And Northern Europe has to ask whether it's idealistic enough about it to make some of the transfers that may be required going forward. You can't look at it purely in the sense of euros and cents. It has to be much more about what's the longer term goal and how do we feel about it as Europeans rather than individuals or nations. Of course, a whole lot of stuff goes into that. How much sovereignty are you willing to give up? How much sort of common rules do you want? And, you know, different folks have different takes on that. But I would say that is an existential question for Europe now.
So existential questions for Europe. We've talked about Donald Trump and his determination, as he would see it, to make that a V-shaped recovery in the US. But who do you see emerging from this COVID-19 pandemic in the best economic shape? The latest IMF analysis suggests that while Europe and the US will see steep contractions by the end of this year, maybe 6% of GDP contraction, China will eke out growth of perhaps 1 or maximum 1.5% to 2%. India will still be growing, but only about 1%. Do you think this is going to hasten the shift in the balance of economic power in the world to the east, to China, and to some extent India as well?
Well, first, I think these numbers will have to be revised given more recent data. China may well eke out a 0% growth, but I think India will not do as well, probably negative 3, 4, maybe more. And of course, Brazil and Russia have also experience significant rises in cases and worry about their economic performance. The reality is this is actually going to be as crushing a blow for the emerging markets, with the exception of a few like Vietnam, South Korea, and China that have managed to contain the pandemic. And the problem for many emerging markets and developing countries, especially in Africa, is that they're so dependent on a few commodities, on trade for recovery, that even if they manage to contain the virus and prevent the extensive damage that is likely, given they have few resources to bail out firms and people, there is the problem of what happens after. How does the recovery take place? And they simply don't have the resources for a substantial stimulus. So their stimulus depends on industrial countries growing strongly and buying their stuff. And, with all the constraints on trade we saw before the virus, and now the massive fight that seems to be brewing between the US and China, I really hope the world, post-COVID comes together, because we really can't afford a trade war, especially in a number of the poorest countries in the world.
It's interesting you say that, because all of the indications are that rising economic nationalism and protectionism is exactly what we are going to see. And I'm very mindful that you wrote a book last year called The Third Pillar, in which you looked at the relationship between capitalism and democracy. And you wrote, if people lose their faith in the ability to compete in the marketplace, if their communities continue to decline, if they feel the elite has appropriated all opportunity for itself, popular resentment can turn to rage. Surely the COVID-19 pandemic and the spiral of economic misery you've just outlined is going to, is it not, lead to that popular resentment leading to more rage?
Almost surely, yes. So what sort of hope is there? My hope is that we sort of see that this cannot go on. Something which is unsustainable has to stop. We can't have periodic crises, huge levels of inequality, massive spending, and then repeat every 10 years. We need to start tackling the problems that afflict capitalism, and we need to start thinking, how do we fix this inequality, which is problematic and which is creating, according to some people, the weakness of demand that causes us to have these massively stimulating monetary policies that lead to the debt buildup and all the conservatism in me that you've talked about. So we need to start thinking about the real economy. How do we make it fairer?
But Mr. Rajan, you're a very well-connected economist. You point to me one global leader right now who is taking on that difficult task of talking genuine economic transformation, for this being a moment of opportunity to rethink capitalism. Name me one.
So I do think the US presidential election will offer some semblance of that choice. That is, the Democrats are certainly putting forward an alternative view. I think perhaps under Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, it was a little extreme. But I do think that Joe Biden has been moved a little more towards that camp. I do think the debates that it will create or it will engender will be very important because it talks about the sustainability of society going forward. To my mind, this U.S. presidential election is one of the most, like every U.S. presidential election, but this one in particular, about resetting the tone both for the dialogue within the United States, but perhaps across the world.
Sorry, I'm trying to read between the lines. Are you saying 4 more years of Donald Trump would be disastrous, not just for the US economy, but for the global economy?
You can read between the lines. Let me say again, I think this is an election which offers an important choice to the American people. And
let's talk about the country from which your family hails, India. You were obviously, as I said, the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, very senior advisor to the governments of Mr. Modi and his predecessors. You fell out, I think it's fair to say, with Mr. Modi and his party over economic policy making, and some in his party said that you, in the end, proved that you were not a true Indian. because you didn't take care of, for example, the small business people who wanted access to credit that you wouldn't give them. So the question is, Mr. Modi, despite the fact that infection rates are at the moment rising in India, is extraordinarily popular, and his brand of Hindu nationalism appears more popular than ever. Do you look at India and believe that Modi has a sustainable project and program for his country or not?
Well, I think if you look at India over the last few years, unfortunately, economic growth has been declining. And we've seen, the budget deficits grow. We've seen a rise in bad debts in the system, partly as a result of the easy credit that you said I was opposed to. And as a result, India enters this crisis in a somewhat different situation than other countries. It still has a substantial amount of foreign exchange reserves, and it still is a big country with enormous resources, but they have to be used well. Now, so far, if you look at the overall infections as well as the death rates, they're relatively small compared to the population. The worry is they're still growing after a substantial period of lockdown. And in fact, some of the management of this crisis, whereby a number of migrants left the cities for their villages, may in fact cause the virus to expand in those areas. So India is in a difficult situation today. It does need to find the reforms that would enable it to grow, but it also needs to spend more money in stimulating the economy back to growth.
Well, I think Indians will be fascinated to hear you, Mr. Rajan, saying the government needs to spend more money. But let's ask you one specific question to end about globalization. Here's a dramatic quote from the current World Bank chief economist, Carmen Reinhart. I think COVID-19 is the nail in the coffin of globalization. You've referred to your fears for an all-out US-China trade war. Is globalization dead?
It can't be dead. And that's the problem, right? We have a growing, an elderly population growing in industrial countries. Demand is going to slow down. We have a young population in the emerging markets, and Africa is really, really very young. So if you look at the economic opportunities going forward, they're so big in fostering a genuine globalization, which works for everyone. My argument has been the democratic backing for globalization has been wanting, in part because we haven't made sure the people left behind, especially in industrial country communities, but also in emerging markets, that they haven't had a fair shot. And that's why you see a growing resistance. And my belief is if we rethink this, and this goes back to new leadership, to rethink this process and to put in place policies that will lead to a better globalization for all, both for the industrial countries and the developing and emerging markets. Now, for that, I really think we need to rethink our whole system.
But in a word, and we must end now, but in a word, you seem to be saying without new and different and more ambitious leadership in the world, we are in for years of misery and possibly worse.
It's the commodity in shortest supply today, and we really need that. As you said, things can get much worse. But hopefully we can turn this world around. I mean, there's so many big global challenges, climate change, for example, that we need to deal with. And for that, you need global cooperation. But for that, you need leaders, and not just in the US, in China, elsewhere, who are willing to work together to create that new world. So I'm hopeful that disaster brings rethinking, and rethinking then creates the possibility of a better tomorrow. But that's hopeful me.
Well, we'll stick with hopeful you, at least for now. Raghuram Rajan, it's been a pleasure having you on Hard Talk. Thanks for joining me from Chicago.
Thank you.